Right, we on?
Hey, Sando's on one day.
Sando's upside down. He's turned the moustache off. Names, phase, phase. Ooh, SSC's podcast. Welcome to episode 5 of the Sports Science Collective podcast. We are talking all things strength training today. But before we get into that and into the listener question on injury prevention programs, going to go around the screen and say hello to my co-hosts, starting with, for me, top left, Sandon. How are you going, mate?
Going well. For all those out there, since our last meeting, I've been in quarantine, actually, as a primary close contact for a COVID case. COVID, as everybody knows. So I've been doing my time, staying indoors, getting tested, and come at a good time, actually, because before that, I broke my finger playing football. So it's all been happening over here.
So it was a break. We're making fun of your leather poisoning, but you actually did break it.
Yeah. So there you go. So update is that it'll be in a split for 6 weeks and then slowly building up from there.
Yeah, right. How are you feeling about lockdown, mate? Are you able to work okay?
Haven't worked, but luckily I'm at day 12 currently, so I have 2 days left in quarantine. So tested tomorrow with a negative result. I'll be walking as a free man once again.
Yeah, right. I feel like
as free as you can be, Sando.
Yeah, well, you're still in lockdown, mate.
Yeah. I feel like Morgan Freeman
at least
needs to be narrating this. It's like Shawshank.
Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah.
I'll at least be able to go further than the front door.
Yeah. There are only 5 reasons to leave the house, though, Sam.
I can't. Yeah. Currently, I have no reasons to leave the house. So, mate, 5 reasons is a blessing.
It's improving by 500%. That's right.
Well, you got behind you there the Jumanji. You've got
I just noticed that.
Oh, mate, I've been cracking into them. Trust me.
Yeah.
You got a Nerf gun down there?
I do.
Target practice going okay?
Mate, my partner was on the phone today, and she was my target practice, moving target. So I'm well.
Hey,
say hello to my little friend.
let's move on. Shall we? Next up, Jared, how are you going, mate?
Going very well, thanks, mate. Looking forward to lockdown being over, but not much to report from me. Work has been good, busy, steady. The puppy definitely enjoys lockdown. But yeah, that's it. Very quiet in St Leonard's, as you all know.
Yeah, it's a nice place of the world, but it is quiet. Rhino, how are you going, mate?
Yeah, not too bad. Got locked down for a day because the partner had to get a COVID test. But apart from that, it's pretty uneventful week. I had to go to the vet last night. The puppy had an allergic reaction to something, so that was interesting. I puffed up. That's about as much entertainment that I've had for the last week and a half.
Jeez, it's all system goes here, isn't it? We're all
little heckers tried to eat a bee.
Yeah, I've got a hip injury, so you got broken finger, stuck at home, boring in St Leonard's, dog sick, and hip injury. We're doing well, listeners.
The SSC C over 70s podcast.
Absolute wounders. Get out the violins. All right, let's jump into the ep, shall we? We will start with the listener question. We didn't have a listener question last time because we had the great Brock Freeman joining us to talk about all things hamstrings. But tonight we do have a listener question. Let's see what was sent through, mate. I think it was a listener question for Sandon.
It definitely was one for Sando. If you haven't listened to the last podcast, make sure you listen to it. Anything related to hamstrings, great listen, by the way. All right, Sando, what are your thoughts on the FIFA 11 injury prevention program? Does it work? And should other sports try to adapt these programs for their own benefit?
So I'm going to jump in right before that. What is the FIFA 11/FIFA 11 plus injury prevention program before you answer whether it works, Sando?
Yeah, they're great questions. the FIFA 11 or FIFA 11 Plus injury prevention program was something developed in the sort of early 2000s, and sort of combination of between FIFA, their medical assessment and research centre, with the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Centre and the Santa Monica Orthopaedic and Sports Medicine Centre. So a few bodies coming together to put this program together. The program comprises of a complete warm-up aimed at injury prevention, and specifically in soccer players. Obviously, FIFA being the Federation of Soccer worldwide, and the FIFA 11 Plus specifically includes 15 structured exercises. And the good thing about this is that it's actually very easily accessible. You can print it out and use it with team trainings very easily. The exercises are broken into 3 sort of components, and they consist of core stabilization, eccentric thigh muscle training, proprioceptive training, dynamic stabilization, plyometric exercises, and they say that they should all be performed with proper postural alignment. So that's our FIFA 11 Plus. As I said, it's got 3 stages, those 15 exercises, done in a specific sequence. So next question being, does it work, and should other sports take this up? And
Yeah, correct.
so
on that as well, when you're talking about it, do you know of any other such programs in other sports similar to the FIFA 11 program?
yeah, so there's been a recent, systematic review and meta-analysis on the FIFA 11, FIFA 11 Plus, and a few other programs. This article by, and I don't want to get this wrong, but Lemez and colleagues, which was brought out last year. And so this one actually compares the FIFA 11 Plus with the FIFA 11, the Nordic hamstring, the prevention, injury and enhanced performance program, the bounding exercise program, and neuromuscular training program. So a few different types of programs that this systematic review and meta-analysis has looked into. Now, cut a long story short with this one, it's found obviously that, and a lot of research finds that these injury prevention programs do work, and you'll see a lot of stats reporting a between 20 and 30% reduction in injury risk for athletes that complete these programs. However, a lot of the research has been graded as low, moderate quality at best. So obviously there needs to be some stronger evidence to go into these types of programs. Now, I like what these programs are trying to do, obviously prepping the bodies for training and competition, and with the aim of reducing injuries as well. So obviously prevention is a much more proactive approach compared to treating an injury and being more reactive. So that's a big plus for me. In terms of other sports taking these up, definitely I think they should. But I think they definitely need to be specific to the sport, and not just the sport as well, but to the athletes. So, for example, here's for those listening to us, if you click over to YouTube, you'll see where we put up on the screen the FIFA 11 Plus program with the 3 stages and the exercises outlined there. And the 3 stages are essentially just progression. And so my advice would be obviously making this as specific to the sport that you're training and playing for. there's going to be some crossover, obviously, if you're thinking about soccer and AFL and rugby. There's going to be some crossover there, but making your injury prevention or performance prep programs as specific to the sport as possible. Also, making them specific for the athletes as well. So if you've got an athlete playing soccer who has had more ankle injuries compared to someone who's had more hip injuries in the past, then you might have an additional focus for that injury history as well. Because we know the biggest predisposing factor for future injuries is previous injuries. So that would be my recommendation. So making it as specific as possible for the sport, but also for that particular athlete. Now, that's going to be pretty difficult. I think we can all agree for community-based athletes. Time and resources is a big factor. And that is one of the biggest, factors around these types of programs is compliance. Actually doing these programs. These programs are great, but actually putting the time and the effort into doing them. I'm not sure if you guys have noticed it as well in your experiences, but in my experience with soccer and AFL, these programs are done really, really well in the beginning. So during pre-season and the start of the season, but they do tend to take a back seat as the season progresses. And that's when you would say athletes or those types of athletes are probably at a higher risk of injuries later in the season compared to in the beginning.
So that I think that's super important to explore. I have found the same thing, and I suspect it's cultural, but these injury prevention programs are pretty quick. They're not taking a lot of time, so you don't have to go through all of those exercises. There are different stages. And they are designed to be implemented as part of the warm-up, mostly, certainly the FIFA 11 and the new women's AFL Prep to Play is much the same concept. So they're quick, and they might have up to 30% injury reduction capacity, which are both big ticks for me. So why are they not being used? Like, if you can have your cake and eat it too, why are people not? What do you think the barriers to using these injury prevention programs are?
I think one thing, as you mentioned, is a cultural aspect. Coaches want to spend as much time as possible on skill and practical components of training. So they'll chew into things that they feel may not be as beneficial. So warm ups, injury prevention, those types of components. They'll cut them down. They'll make them shorter. And you see it all the time. Coaches saying, go for a quick run, and then we'll get straight into this drill. Compared to there might have been a few months earlier where they do a warm up which lasts sort of 10 to 15, 20 minutes, and is really adequate. Another component I think around culture is the players themselves. So I've seen as well clubs giving the onus to the players and saying, here half an hour earlier and complete this injury prevention warm up. And players will get there half an hour earlier, but they'll dawdle around. They'll
do the fat, Sando. Catch up with each other. We've got 30 minutes to see what's been going on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they'll go through the exercises with minimal intent, which they may get some benefit out of just doing the exercises, but as we know again, if you go through certain exercises with intent for that exercise or that movement, you're going to have a better outcome.
That's kind of why we're big advocates for having, sports scientists, and a sports scientist can be anyone from undergraduate to postgraduate level, or someone like Letzi, who's at a local football club. Huge advocates for having somebody at the club, pay them a little bit of money, and they can crack the whip with this type of thing. They can make sure, one, they're doing it right, but two, that it gets done. And then, that's what we're talking about, culture and making sure that we do hit all our targets. Pay a little bit of money, get your Letzi or your sports scientist or your S&C coach at the club, and they can help with implement programs like this really easily. Yeah.
But so that not only from a good idea about implementation and making sure people do it, but as you hinted at, that they do it right. Because you're also right, Sandon. You could do it with intent, but you could do it 100% wrong. And so you're doing it with all the intent and vigor you can, but the exercise is as detrimental as it could possibly be. And that seems to be something I have seen as a limitation with a lot of these, is that the validity is not necessarily that high, because the people implementing these programs might not be skilled in how they should. And you have to think about a lot of these community club coaches and trainers that are not qualified in any capacity. They finish their job at 4:30 and get to footy training at 5:30, and they've found themselves as a carpenter during the day and the footy coach at night.
Yeah.
And so a drill done 99% right is 100% wrong. And so I think it's very, very prudent that you have those correct staff making sure it's done well also.
That's a perfect word though, Wardy. And I think that something is better than nothing. That's why I like programs like the FIFA 11. It's simple to implement.
Yeah.
And when we don't have the qualified staff there, there's not much better you could do.
It's serving the program on a platter.
But like you said earlier, Jared, that having someone at the club might cost you a bit of money, but at the end of the day, if you get 10 hamstring injuries through pre-season, how much does that cost you in terms of them going to a physio, them getting the treatment they need to come back, and potentially missing these players for important games? So
I don't know if I agree with you though that something's better than nothing. Like I get why you would say that, but I hear that a lot in in biological sciences, that something's better than nothing. And well, I would just say tooth decay. Is tooth decay better than no tooth decay? And the answer is, of course, no.
Well, I
And
think your perspective's wrong there. It would be saying brushing your teeth poorly is better than not brushing your teeth at all, and hence tooth decay is the outcome.
Yeah, well, there you go. You've stumped me in my tracks there. But I mean, is it like if you do it wrong regularly and thoroughly, is that better than not doing it at all? And I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I don't have the answer, and I don't think there's a study on it.
I have a response for that, Warnie. Let's say they're doing something wrong in their, injury prevention program. The chances are they're probably doing a similar thing wrong when they're playing sport anyway. So by training something that they're already doing wrong in a controlled environment might reduce their risk of injury in an uncontrolled environment, such as a match. And I know it's not ideal, but sometimes exposing them to potential movement patterns that are not ideal might allow them to withstand those movement patterns when that happens in that uncontrolled environment.
Yeah, I get it. I very much.
That kind of
I have to agree with that.
Lends itself to what we're going to talk about tonight too. So nice. Let's see.
Look, I think the crux of it, if you can have someone there, that's the best outcome for a club, and not just for quality, but for actual compliance as well.
And consistency. Yeah, exactly.
It's great to have a program, and for example, at the football club I'm at, they have a program and they put it there for the players to run themselves. I know at least 50 or 60% of those players don't go through the whole program. Now, that program takes 10 minutes. And if you had someone there holding the program and picking people off, or just ensuring people are actually doing it, you would see that, because we've had quite a few injuries, I think there would be a correlation between those players completing that program more regularly and the club seeing a reduction in the injury risk of players.
Definitely. I'd agree with that.
So what I'm saying here is a bit of a hierarchy of quality, and I've just taken a couple of notes. So at the top level of quality for our warm-up programs, we would have a specific program, and when I say specific, I mean specific to the sport, specific to the athlete, implemented by a staff member day to day. That's tier 1. Tier 2 would be a generic program such as the FIFA 11 Plus with a staff member, so that staff member can make sure that they're doing it properly and that they're doing it all the time. Tier 3 would be a generic program like the FIFA 11 Plus with no staff, and so that the players or the skills coach is implementing the program, or so no physio, no sports science staff. That would be tier 3, and tier 4 is no program, so just make it up on the spot. And I think that's the takeaway for us. If you can get a staff member and you can have a specialized program, that's great. If you have a staff member and a generic program, that's next. If you have a generic program and no staff, that's next, and then no program. It's obviously not what we're advocating for at all. So, what do you guys think? Is that a good way to wrap up?
That's a great way to wrap it up, I reckon.
Yeah, and I think the other point is that staff member should, in my opinion, definitely be someone who, with a sports science background of some sort. I think it gets lumped onto, again, in community sports, onto the physio or the head trainer maybe too often, when their role is to be more so in the assessment and treatment of injuries.
Yeah.
And they should have someone else, I guess, implementing that injury prevention.
Totally. There are hundreds and hundreds of sports science students graduating from undergraduate degrees, every year. So, I mean, there's plenty of people who are capable.
Yeah.
For sure.
And that just lumps something extra onto a physio, which they don't necessarily have the time to do.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
There's a message. There's a message for the leagues. Get sports science graduates in your teams
and pay them something. Stingers. All right, let's move to the next part. That was a fantastic summary, by the way, there, Baz, and a very good answer, Sando. So we are going to talk about our next part of the episode, which is looking at strength qualities. And now this initially came about by a nice little figure that I found earlier in the week. Can you pop that up for us, Dr. Letta?
Yeah, give me.
Now, Warnie, this figure is really good. How do you come across figures like this in your day-to-day travels, mate? How do you consume information like this? How do you find it?
Well, I just got the matrix eyes going over all PubMed and EBSCOhost, and I actually found this on Instagram, mate.
Oh, there you go. Perfect.
This has come from Coach Steve Foulds, who is
shout out to Fouldsy.
Yeah, works a lot with strength and conditioning athletes.
Some great memes at times.
He does. He's about to start his PhD too, and he is very much across strength training and coach athlete relationship also. But he posted this about strength being important, and it reminded me a lot of an article that came out a few years ago by, I'm probably going to butcher their name, so I apologize, but Sukamal, Nymphius, and Stone in 2016, which is called The Importance of Muscular Strength and Athletic Performance. And I thought we could kind of talk about that, because I think strength is misunderstood, and I think it's misunderstood by the athletic population right from the start, which is in its definition. And the reason I say that, in my recent change to endurance running, I hear all the time, you need to do your 30K runs to develop your strength. Now, that is about as far from the definition as I could think is possible. So from the strength and conditioning, biomechanics, even physiological lens, what is the definition of strength? Let's see, can you give me that?
Yep, sure can. Like you said, it's a very misunderstood concept, given that strong and strength can be used in so many different contexts, not just in sport or strength training. But when we talk about strength in the context of sport and strength training, we're talking about this thing called muscular strength. And it's a broad term that we use to sort of describe the ability of our muscles to produce force. It doesn't actually define or describe how that force is produced. It's just a general statement that we produce force with our muscles, basically. So there's different qualities or components of strength that can play a role in how you exhibit or express that strength in your sport. And we're going to sort of touch on a few of these today, I know.
And so further to that, the definition of maximal strength has largely been described as the ability to overcome an external resistance in any time frame. So thinking for the layperson, it might be the ability to pick up a heavy object, the heaviest object you can off the ground with no time constraints. Often though, you'll hear the addition with good form, which I think is an important one. We'll talk about form in a bit.
And I think, and this is a little gripe with the terminology that we use nowadays. There's so many different terms used to describe strength, and some of the terms mean the same thing. I believe we should be describing it as our force generating capacities and talking about how we generate force, because force is the underpinning variable that we use to define strength. So why don't we define it as force?
Or force generation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've put me onto a really good wavelength there, lad. So strength is measured in force, which is measured in newtons, and because of that, we can have the total amount of force, but we can also have the rate of force, so how quickly we can produce that force, and we can also have the impulse, so how long we can apply that force for, and all of those things impact strength, or strength impacts all of those things, I guess is a better way of looking at it. So an easy example for you, tell me, in a sport like powerlifting or strongman with an atlas stone, what am I talking about there? What sort of strength qualities are we referring to?
Well, in those type of sports, we're not so much restricted by time. Yes, time is an important element in some of the competitions they do. But in powerlifting, for example, your goal is to lift the heaviest weight in each of the 3 lifts that you do. So it's your ability to generate the maximum amount of force that you can. And it doesn't have to be quick. It doesn't have to be slow. You can do it anyway, as long as you can lift that heavy object off the ground or do a bench press or whatever it might be. So in a sport like powerlifting or strongman, it's your ability to produce your maximum force. So that maximal strength component that a lot of people talk about, that seems to be the most important quality of strength that we need in that type of sport.
And it's typically relevant to, sorry to interject, let's see, it's typically relevant to the absolute mass being moved as well. You know, like those strongman or powerlifting, obviously they've got weight categories, but the person who wins is the person who can lift the heaviest object. Like if it's 500 kilos, it's 500 kilos. It's not 499. No, it's not 499 divided by your body weight. It's who has the ability to lift the most amount of mass. And that's what I think of when I think max strength. Who's got the strength to lift the biggest amount of mass? I don't know if that's any helpful or not. Anyway. Sorry to get you off the train of thought.
No, that's good.
And so, sorry, go on, let's.
I was going to spring to Jared for this next one, which I think you're just about to do anyway, Warnie. In that type of context, it's all about the most weight you can lift, the maximal strength that you have. But then in some sports, we are restricted by time, and sprinting is an example of that. How would strength be important in sprinting, Bazza? Because you don't have that time to generate a max amount of force anymore, because we're limited in our time to apply that force.
Yeah, exactly. So when we're talking about sprinting, and sprinting is determined by our stride rate and stride frequency, but also, sorry, they're the same thing, stride length and stride frequency, sorry. But with that comes the amount of time that our foot is on the ground, and that's called our contact time. And whilst your foot is on the ground, that's your opportunity to impart force into the ground to propel you forward. And so when we're sprinting at max speed, what we actually want to do is have our foot on the ground for the least amount of time, because if we can reduce the amount of time that our foot is on the ground, but apply the same amount of force, we can run faster, basically. So max strength or strength, muscular strength, as we've termed it tonight, if you can apply the same amount of force in less time, you will run faster. And that's what we're talking about. So contact time. So if your foot's on the ground for 0.3 of a second, and I'm just going to make up a number here so it's nice and easy for us, and you can impart 10 units of force, okay? But then you do strength training, you increase muscular strength. If your foot is on the ground for 0.3 of a second, but you can impart 20 units of strength, you will run faster. And I think that's what we're talking about here. If you can increase the ability to deliver that more force in the same amount of time, then you'll run faster.
And so that's rate of force development, Baz, that you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So you're producing more force quickly, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So
you might be able to add to that. I think, Morny, the biomechanist.
Well, yes, either producing the same amount of force in a quicker time, or
more force in the same time.
or greater force in the same time. Yeah, that'd be both sides of it. And so one interesting thing to that though, Baz. So I think about your sport in cricket and pace bowling. And I think we think too much about force as in, we really think about it in sporting context concentrically. How quick can I contract my muscles through shortening? But it's not all
like
about
a squat
that.
or a deadlift, isn't it?
Yeah, well, even in running, like you just mentioned about generating force during contact time, but it's also about absorbing force. And cricketers are, I would say, perhaps the kings of absorbing force, because the pace bowlers
and javelin throwers,
javelin throwers, the same sort of thing. So what happens when you run in at you're approaching the crease? What happens at the crease?
So we run sort of horizontal. Well, we run horizontally across ground at, and your approach speed might be, and let's see, you might be able to throw some numbers at this, but I reckon mine will be about 13 or to 15 kilometers per hour.
If not faster.
If not faster. And then basically you do a little hop and you stop dead on the spot. And so you're turning all of that horizontal force into basically a complete stop vertically into the ground, which acts as a catapult. And so it's about, like you said, Warnie, absorbing your body mass running at 15 Ks plus an hour in an instant, in one leg as well. And I think that's kind of where you're heading with eccentric force, Warnie, is because at front foot contact for cricketing, it's about absorbing the horizontal force and then translating it into vertical force to act as a catapult, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry, I need to put some context to this just stopping of your body. Anyone that knows cricket would know the name Brett Lee. He's reported to be putting upwards of sort of 10 times his own body weight through his front leg in vertical force.
So if he weighs
also horizontal force.
If he weighs 90 kilos, it's 900 kilograms in an instant at the front leg.
Yeah, and the time frame they have is like less than 100 milliseconds in these elite guys that are doing. So they're producing these forces at the front leg in really short periods of time, and they basically have to absorb that force and just continue moving their body to bowl that delivery at whatever it is that they release the ball at.
So incredible amounts of eccentric muscular strength, Warnie. I think that's where you were going with that.
Yeah, it is exactly, and that's measured by something we term reactive strength index, which is the ability to harness or absorb that force and then utilize it in a different direction. So a good example of that would be, I'll talk about how we measure it. We measure it on a contact mat, and so you jump from a known height onto a mat, and then bound up as quick as you can. And so the classic plyometric idea of jumping or repeated jumping,
the drop jump.
Yeah, the drop jump. And we can measure reactive strength index, which is an index or an amount of how quickly we can change that strength or react to a slowing or deceleration. Now, one thing I think is really important to clarify is the definitions. And I know this is something that Letzi has a particular gripe about. So a good example of that there is rate of force development versus power. And are they different? And if we're talking about that context of sprinting, they can pretty much be used interchangeably. So rate of force development is strictly the time of the time it takes to reach a peak force. Now, the determinant is, though, what is that peak? Is it a peak for a context, as in the peak sport in sprinting, or is it an outright peak, as in the
Peak
amount
total,
of
like
which you
MVC.
might
Yeah.
establish through an isometric mid thigh pull, where the power is force times velocity. So how fast are you creating that force? But the difference is that in rate of force development, we have a destination, and in power, we might not. So we have a peak of force in rate of force development, and in power, we have how much force is applied, how quickly, and so they do differ a little bit. And you'll often hear power defined as kind of explosive strength as well, and that's because it is the optima, or the combination of both strength,
Speed and force.
speed and force, or strength and velocity. And so we have, which is really like really relevant to sport, this thing called the force velocity curve.
Do we have a picky of it?
Yeah, well, can you try and describe to me the force velocity power curve, and I'll try and find a picture while you do that.
Yeah, so basically the force velocity curve describes the velocity of a movement at a given, if you like, weight. So we'll use weight as an example. So the lighter the weight, so let's say you did a jump without any additional mass added to your body, your velocity of the movement will be at its highest point. Now, if we start loading up your body with some weights, so we put a barbell on your back, that velocity will start to decrease of your movement. And as we get heavier, we see this decrease as we get to the maximum load that you can move. So by the time you get to that maximum weight that we can put on that bar, you're going to move that very slowly in comparison to what you could do without that weight on the bar.
So it's basically a chart on an XY graph, right? Let's see where you start with your maximum velocity and your lightest weight, and then your maximum weight and your slowest velocity at the other end.
So for those following along, let's get this photo up. All right, can you see this?
We can see that. So for those of you listening at home, we've got a picture here which has force on the left-hand axis there, the y-axis.
Vertical axis.
Yeah, vertical axis. That's a good way to say it. And shortening velocity, or you can think of that as velocity, or even
getting slower.
So how fast we are moving in straight line on the x-axis there. And the key takeaway from this particular chart is that when shortening velocity is low or none, force is really high. And you can think about that in isometric contractions, which is why we use them to establish maximum force. If I ask you to try and push over a wall, you could push as hard as you want, and you're not going to be able to push over that wall. But you're generating maximum force in trying to do that. The other end of that spectrum, though, is velocity. And so if force is very low, the velocity can be really high. And if you think about that in throwing, if I was trying to throw an 8-kilo kettlebell, I probably would be able to throw it a meter or two. If I was trying to throw a golf ball, then I might throw it 30, 40, 50 meters, because the weight of that is much less. So the force component is much less, so I can move it faster. Now, the trade-off of both of those things, though, in kind of the middle, it's a little more to the left-hand side, is power. And so maximum power occurs somewhere around 30 to 50% of maximum velocity. And so that's really important, because people, this force velocity power curve will be different for different people. And so some those with lots of type 2B fast twitch fibers, so there's glycolytic fibers, we'll be able to produce more force at all points in that curve, as opposed to someone with more slow twitch fibers. But the key takeaway point there is that power is the optima, or the trade-off between force and velocity. And knowing that means we can manipulate that through training.
So, Wani, to interject there.
Go interject.
This is my gripe with the term power, is that power is dependent on the velocity of the movement. Now, there's an argument to say that we don't have any movement at a joint during sprinting because it's an isometric contraction and the movement comes through the stretching of a tendon, for example, or it's isometric in nature, one of the two. Now, if we have no velocity, we have no power.
So you're talking about at the instant of contact, foot contact?
Yeah, for example, yes.
Well, if we're dealing in the realms of instantaneous, then yes, there would be no power, because if you're talking about that zillionth of a second at which you contact the ground, and you're transitioning from kind of decelerating to a stop, and then shifting over that fulcrum, then if there's no velocity, there will be no power. Now, of course, while that might strictly be true, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter, because that's not what happens in the sport. And so we would
Still
define
being
it.
generated, you mean?
Can I still bring it back to another example of cricket?
Yeah, sure.
And now we know that some cricketers don't flex their knee when they hit the front leg hits the crease. They have a fixed knee position. So there is no, if you like, power. And if we're using power to describe our force generating capacity, you would say that zero power is advantageous to throwing the ball faster, basically, which we know is not the fact, because you're still generating massive amounts of force, but because there's no movement occurring at those particular joints where that force is being developed, power doesn't describe the potential importance of force generating capacity.
What would you propose the terminology should be?
Well, it's difficult. I like rate of force development, because rate of force development can be developed without velocity and of a joint, for example, but it can be included in a joint movement. If we have high rate of force development and we also have movement at a joint, generally speaking, you're going to have, if you like, better power. So I know it's important. Velocity of movement is important when deciding on the type of activity you want to train, because certain activities you need to move fast and you need to generate force fast. But it gets confusing when people start using the term power in movements that don't actually involve any movement, if you like.
I think it's like it almost sounds like a philosophical debate we're having, but it sounds like if the movement is isometric, there is no power. Is that kind of what you're saying? Because there's no joint movement. An isometric contraction is when there's no joint movement occurring, then there's no power. And I get that in terms of you can't multiply anything by zero. That doesn't make sense. Excel says div divided by 1 error. It's like, yeah, I get that, but I think in the applied sense, and probably what our listeners would prefer to hear. So, well, if there's no power, what do you mean, Letzi? What do you mean?
Well, I think the takeaway is that force is developed in a multitude of ways. There's no just you produce force concentrically, say pushing an object. Force can be produced isometrically, it can produce eccentrically, it can be done fast or slow. It can be done slow and then fast in the same move. Like, there is a multitude of ways that force is developed. And I think the takeaway is that if you understand how that force is developed, you can then implement a training program to target those specific force generating capacities within that athlete.
That's a beautiful, which makes perfectly back to our diagram, which might be worth putting back up again for our viewers, but just to describe the diagram to our listeners again, this is a diagram that has muscular strength and maximal strength as well. At the core of like Letsy said, a multitude of different muscular capacities or movement capacities. And I think that's one of the key points that we want to highlight in this episode, is that strength as a general rule is the ability to produce force, but it underpins all of these really critical sporting performance parameters. And I think that's exactly what you're just saying, Letsy, is that movement happens in all sorts of different ways. And depending on the way that movement does happen, should guide the decisions you make around the types of training that you do.
Yeah.
Bonnie, would you agree?
I definitely agree.
I agree also, and I understand what you're saying when in the definitions, and you are right to say that it gets
it's semantics, I know,
but it does muddy the waters, so to speak. But it is prevalent, and an example of that, just looking at this chart here, maximal speed, it actually says. If I was to think about it in that, using that definition that you just provided me, well, I couldn't describe maximal speed, because you're talking about, each instant of foot contact velocity is zero, and so speed is also zero. Speed and velocity in a straight line are interchangeable qualities.
Yeah, well, that would be speed at the foot, not speed at the center of mass.
Yeah, and so the important takeaway is, well, let's ignore the semantics to an extent and say in order to move at a maximum velocity or speed, then I need to be able to impart as much force as I can into the ground within the time constraints that I have. So I have to be able to produce that force as quickly as possible, which I agree with you. The term rate of force development does
suits
describe
better.
that
it does
well.
suit it better. Yep.
And that terminology is a discussion for people smarter than us to debate over.
Yeah.
But just be aware that there are different terminologies thrown out there. For instance, speed, strength, power, reactive strength, explosive strength. What are the differences in these? So make sure that you understand the fundamental concept behind force is developed differently, and we should train that force according to what your sport requires you to train.
So, going a step to the left, we'll say, would you train power or would you train rate of force development?
You could measure power if you're doing like a plyometric based activity. I think it's terminology and it's probably semantics. I would train the quality of rate of force development in the context specific to your sport. So if you need to absorb a load and do it rapidly, I would train that and call that rate of force development and refer to it as an eccentric rate of force development. Or if you need to do that from an eccentric to concentric contraction, I'll probably term it reactive strength rather than a power related activity. A reactive strength can be defined a number of different ways if you like, but you could focus more on the force component or the speed of the movement component if you like. Again, this is where all these different terminologies are. Make it confusing for people that aren't immersed in sports science.
And I know I'm just throwing you a bit of a curveball.
It was a beautiful question.
Well, no, I think it's a really important one though, and that's why what I was going to get at. The semantics often undermine the practice.
Exactly, the application. Exactly.
To give you an example, if I in my sport of cycling or sprint cycling that I did for many years, where you're pedaling, so you're pedaling around that central axis. The cranks are attached to the bottom of the bike. If I wanted to develop power, then the way in which I would develop that power, well, there's three ways, and this is the important takeaway. I would try to work on my ability to generate maximum force. I would try to work on my ability to move as fast as possible, so maximum velocity, and I would try to work across the range of those things, which would be seen as kind of the power of those. And so the kind of takeaway here, ignoring the semantics of it, is that on that force velocity curve, maximum strength is occurring at very, very slow to no movement velocities. Maximum velocity is occurring at very low forces. And kind of power or explosive strength for that term is occurring somewhere in the middle there, and that's ignoring the semantics of it. And I think that's important because that's what coaches gravitate to, those qualities. Um,
So,
let's-
Warnie,
yeah.
would you also go from it from a fourth angle of, as you said, the ability to produce your maximum force? What about also improving what your maximum force is?
Well, so
Not just
that's
the
where I was
ability.
just about to go.
That was a
And
point I
so,
was just about to make as well, Warnie.
so we
Delicious.
need to work on developing what that maximum force is. And now the best bit is that it's the most modifiable aspect. So velocity is really hard to change. So you can get better at moving fast because there is a skill acquisitional component, but it's mostly determined by neurological qualities that you will reach a maximum of very quickly. And so how your nerve conduction velocity and your fiber type will determine your max velocity, and those things are really genetically predetermined, and they won't change a lot with.
We haven't worked out training methods to increase myelination of our nerve fibers, have we?
yeah. There are banned substances that may help with that, but we're not advocating the use of those. So the point is, like, you can't really change those qualities, but you can increase strength, and you can increase strength quite rapidly. But there are two main ways in which we would increase maximum strength, and one is, if I'm talking in physiology, one is through neuromuscular changes, and the other is through morphological changes. And when we're referring to those neuromuscular changes, we're talking about really an increased, like, descending drive, so an increased signal from the brain down, a better synchronization of the motor unit activation, and then an increase in motor unit recruitment as well. So motor units are the things that initiate muscle
So
contraction.
basically, we make more highways from the brain to the muscle.
Well, we make more highways, and then we put more cars on them too, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's
And increase the speed limit.
Well, yeah, all of those things, yeah, and then
How good's a metaphor?
increase the synchronicity of them so that they're all like German autobahns and driving in the same direction at a nice high speed.
Perfect.
And
these are all outcomes of strength training, though, right, Warnie? We're not saying, you go and train your neuromuscular system. You get these benefits from strength training.
You do get those benefits from strength training, and you especially get those benefits from strength training when you lift heavy and or explosively. But the problem with those changes is that they occur quite quickly. So we're talking 6 weeks to 6 months.
The first month, yeah.
Yeah, and then we have morphological adaptations, and what we're talking about there is the increase in cross-sectional area of the whole muscle and individual muscle fibers, and that's mostly to do with an increase in myofibrillar size and number. And
basically,
so
your muscle's getting bigger.
the muscle's getting bigger, yeah, and it's getting bigger because of hyperplasia and because of increased satellite cell activity. So the muscle's getting bigger, and it's getting better at receiving that signal from the brain.
Better at using the muscles.
Yeah, exactly. And so those are the things that underpin
force generation.
Generation. And so if we can maximize those, then all of those other components on that chart you showed can be improved.
So if you play sport, you play a team sport, Warnie, and you're listening to this and you go, wow, Ryan's just said I can increase my neuromuscular system and I can change my muscle size, but I've never done any strength training before. But Ryan's just told me that it's really important for improving all of these different strength qualities. Is there a type of strength training, rep range, intensity, frequency that is like this is your go-to start for increasing any of these properties? Is there something that you would say this is a good place to start?
CrossFit. No, I would say.
And we're okay with CrossFit. Let's just get that clear. We're a big fan of CrossFit, but
yeah, well,
not for novice, maybe.
I have no issue with it, but in terms of improving your specific quality, no, which is the point of the sport. It's improving lots of things, but the answer is, well, I can give you two answers. The traditional answer is to work within an established rep range, which we teach from the ACSM textbook of 3x8 at 60 to 70% load.
Yes. And that's a nice safe place to start too.
It's a nice safe place, but if you look at that, the problem is, and I get this from students all the time, they'll prescribe an exercise and they'll use the guidelines and they'll say barbell back squat, 3 to 6 reps of 3 to 5 sets at 60 to 90% 1RM. And you're like,
it's too varied. It's too
well,
big,
what is it? Is it
yeah.
5x6 at 90% or 3x3 at 60% or and it's this huge thing. And the problem is because those guidelines are determined by ACSM or NSCA or ASCA or any of those organizations are based on research. And if you get
populations of data,
huge populations. And so if you get this study says, well, we found an improvement with 3x5 at 60%. And then this one says, well, we found, 5x3 at 80%. And then they pull that data and they offer ranges, but that's not really helpful.
It's not helpful, is it? Yeah.
Well, and so as well, on that point, a lot of that data is based on people that don't necessarily do strength training, and it's going to impact based on your experience. So we know that elite athletes, for example, that have a high history of strength training are going to have different requirements in terms of sets and reps they need to do to, say, someone that's never strength trained in their life, who might see benefits from anything that they do.
And that's the most important point, and that's where I was going to get to. If you are starting, anything will help to an extent. If I wanted to get better at running, then I will get better at running by swimming for a little while, because you're just getting a new stimulus. And so the point is, when you're starting those strength training things, don't necessarily do it yourself. Try and find some information, or try and find a strength and conditioning coach or someone that is more experienced. But start low. Start with body weight exercises. Start with low complexity exercises. So do a deadlift from a an elevated box or a plate, or do a squat to a box or something like that. Don't go start straight and say, well, lasher snatches 220, so I reckon I can try that too. Because it's way too complex, and you're starting from nothing, trying to go to everything. And so start light, low complexity, and then try and improve. And the single greatest thing is progression across time, which we've spoken about on this before. This idea of progressive overload, that get to a point where you can lift a given load for the desired sets and reps, and then progress it on top of that. And remember that you can't always go up. Eventually you'll need to deload.
You can't be linear forever. Well. That's a good point.
And I think that's a good point, Lonnie. If we're talking elite athletes, we need to be on the ball a little bit more with their loads and their reps, because the stimulus they need to change or adapt to that training session is that window is a lot smaller than those people that don't have that training background.
Well, and not only that, they don't understand it. And Sandon is in a perfect position to talk about this. Working at Kaiser Physiotherapy, you would see people say to you, and I'm confident of this, they do 5 reps, and you would say, can you do any more? And they'll go, no, can't do any more. I'm at my maximum. And in reality, they could probably do 35 more reps. And the cost of them doing 5 reps is nothing, tiny. The cost of Mart Seam back squatting 380 kilos for 5 reps is going to leave the guy on a bed for 3 weeks. And so understanding your athlete and the cost of that lift is huge. And you'll be surprised when you're a novice. You can progress really quickly, and you can have start to lift. I've seen a lot of people go from deadlifting 50 to 150 in the space of 4, 5, 6 months. To go from 150 to 200 might take 6 years.
Yeah.
The
room for gains early is quite big. Yep.
Yeah,
and I
sure.
think this brings up a good point. Sando shared this before. This photo or image here.
Just describe it to our listeners, would you, Letzi?
Yeah, so it's an image that basically shows a change in strength over time, both from a neural adaptation and a hypertrophy, so an increase in cross-sectional area. It takes time to get to that point. And most training studies only look at maybe 8 weeks. And we know that 8 weeks is not long enough to look at potential adaptations from long-term training. And particularly anyone that's been a strength trainer for a long period of time, we might not actually capture those changes in hypertrophy, because the changes that we've seen in, say, strength has come from these neural adaptations, like Warnie said, occur relatively quick compared to, say, changes in our morphological structures.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, is that a lot of research does only look at that sort of 6 to 12 week mark, which we know, and this diagram shows it perfectly. The main, I guess, portion of that strength is from those neural adaptations. So your body, your brain learning how to move that stimulus in that way. After that point is where the morphological changes occur, but that needs to be sustained for at least 6 to 12 months.
And just to clarify that we're not shitting on these studies that do these 8 weeks interventions. The reality is we can't do long-term training studies because people don't want to do it anymore. They're going to pull out. So yes, it's not ideal that our training studies look on these short periods of time, but we also find it very difficult to do long-term training studies. So it's a bit of, a balancing act. We got to understand there's limitations to what's out there, but we need to also understand that that's probably the best we can do at the time that we're doing the research.
Sorry, Sando, go on.
Oh, so I was just going to say, linking that back to, I guess, our original image that you brought to us, Warnie, of strength. I guess if you're training strength, seeing changes in these additional, physical attributes will obviously take a bit longer than the adaptation seen in your strength. Would that be fair to say?
It would be fair to say in anyone that wasn't a novice. If you're a novice, you're going to get better at all of those things relatively quickly because you're doing something.
Yeah.
But while strength underpins all of these qualities, it's not a perfect relationship. Like the relationship between strength and rate of force development is much clearer and cleaner than the relationship between strength and anaerobic endurance.
Yeah, because there's other physiological pathways that underpin that performance, right?
Yeah, correct. There's other things that come into it. But ignoring those kind of physiological pathways, because they're probably a little outside the context of this discussion. One thing we haven't discussed is expression of force. And now this is super important, and I want to steer the discussion this way for a little bit, not too long, but thinking about if we talk about let's look at sprinting, the act of 100-meter sprinting. One thing we have to be really careful about is how we program our exercises so that they enhance an athlete's performance and don't detract from it. So if I thought about the demands of a 100-meter sprinter, then I would think, well, they need to be explosive, that they need to be able to move fast. But there's also a directional component. They can't just be strong in a vertical plane, as in up and down. So thinking about a squat, for example, they need to be able to produce horizontal force as well. And if we thought about it from a throwing athlete, another good example, well they can't just be strong vertically or horizontally, or even rotationally. They need to be strong in all three. And so specificity is a really, really key context of that. I want to throw to you to just briefly talk to me about the 100-meter sprint. What kind of exercise might I do for, let's say, if I wanted to develop the first 20 meters? And then what sort of exercises would I do if I wanted to develop my ability to produce maximum speed? So after kind of 40 and
Yeah.
beyond.
Well, to just put a clause on that, remember that's going to be specific to your training history. So if we're talking someone that's got a training background, doing at the start of a sprint where we know that we need to overcome your mass, so we're starting at a velocity of 0, we need to accelerate the body up to whatever speed you get to it at the end of the race. So you need the ability to overcome your mass and then accelerate your body in a horizontal plane. So you need the ability to produce high amounts of force to accelerate your body in a horizontal plane. So things like strength, for example, because when we're sprinting at the start, we're generally a little bit more horizontal to the ground with our body. So things like jump squats, for example, which focus more on a bit of strength and that, if you like, greater force development. Squats, again, which can focus more on that force component.
What about banding or double leg leaps or something? Let's say I'm just brainstorming at the moment. I actually don't know.
I would say not so much at the start. So that early out of the blocks, something that's a little bit more force oriented, but still explosive in nature. But bounding definitely for the later aspects of a sprint where you're already up to speed, your acceleration is not as high, potentially you're decelerating now. That ability to move really fast and produce force in the small amount of time becomes more important. So bounding based activities horizontally, that's the important one. Not necessarily doing your plyometrics up and down, making sure that they're horizontal in nature becomes really important, because there's no use you training your ability to go up and down in a sprint. Because the higher you go during your sprint, the less of that momentum's going forward. So you're going to be slow overall. So I think the key here is at the start, you still want to be explosive in nature.
Generating lots of force, yeah.
Lots of force at the same time. So that's sort of that, if you like, on that force velocity curve, that mid-range where we've got some velocity of movement, but we've also got some force occurring. And then as we get faster, that force component becomes less important, and it's more about how quickly you can move yourself. So activities that work on velocity of movement, like your bounding activities or your broad jump, for example, might become more important later on in your sprinting event.
So could I be oversimplistic, or would I be oversimplistic in saying that for generating horizontal velocity at the start out of the blocks, it would be more gym based, whereas top speed or after 40, 60 meters would be more like plyometric bounding based? Is that oversimplifying it?
No, I think that's a pretty accurate statement. Like most of the things that you need to train in the acceleration portion, the early start of your sprint, you probably need to have a gym to train those aspects. You need med balls, weights, whatever else. But everything outside of that, you can train during your normal training session, like you said.
And not to take anything away from the actual sprinter's technique of their takeoff and their sprint.
Yes.
That's a really important thing you just mentioned there, Sando. So that's one of the arguments against using sleds and prowlers, because they although they're awesome at developing that kind of leaned forward posture, sometimes they might alter the sprint mechanics too much.
And
So this is where hypergravity would be awesome.
Yeah, well,
Increase the force within the actual plane and joint motions that it occurs.
Talk to Warren Young, mate. He's for years he's been trying to devise a structure, this instrument which could suddenly add vertical overload to an athlete at top speed. So
That's
if you
what
work
I'm
out
talking about, man. Warren need to get together.
yeah.
What about just weight vests?
Yeah, well, the
but
problem
it's
is
not
that's all the
specific
time though.
And it increases trunk lean, and then you've just got increased back extensor, and that's not sprinting.
And
Well, fortunately, some sports scientists have tried to solve this a little bit, and what you can get, and listeners can look these up, is wearable weights. And so perhaps the most known of these is the Exogen Lila, and I think they're from 100 up to 100 grams up to around a kilo. And so you wear this like neoprene sleeves and things, and you can stick weights to them. And the ability of that is that 100 grams added at the ankle adds quite a bit of load, because the distance is quite far, the distance that the ankle moves, as opposed to adding it right at near thigh. And so you can try and overload in those contexts, but that's getting quite
we digress.
specific. But
I
if
think back to
you
Sandon's point quickly, that specificity that you mentioned earlier, Warnie, we got to be careful. If we try and replicate exactly what we do in a sprinting event in the gym, we might cause those technical changes, which might be detrimental, even though we improve the force component of it.
Yeah,
So
contextual interference. Yep.
That's a balancing act. So I think when we talk about specificity in terms of strength training, we're talking about the ability to generate the force the way that you need to generate the force in the direction that it needs to be done.
Well, which is a perfect segue into what I was just going to mention. We actually have a really good video on this. So if you jump on our YouTube channel, we've got a video on force, velocity, vector. Force meaning how much, velocity, how fast, vector, what direction. Because we've explored this a little bit in the past on YouTube. Because it isn't just about how strong or how fast you are. It's about how well you can express that. And one way I've seen it described, which I think is an awesome way, is in a car. You have the motor, but you also need the transmission, and then you also need the right tires, so that the power from that motor is getting to the wheels, and then when it's at the wheels, it's connecting with the ground properly. And it's kind of that same concept here. And I've seen that happen in many instances in sport, and in which I've seen you have that the person that's the training world champion, they're in the gym and on the ergos and things for certain sports, they're phenomenal, but you put them in their sporting context and not so much, and it's because of those specific requirements. The last thing,
Warnie,
yeah, go on.
And I think a great example of that is when you take an athlete like a gymnast who trains so many different qualities, they're generally pretty good at any other sport they try and do, because they've got this broad training base in terms of strength training, because their sport demands it. But then they can transfer a lot of these qualities to other sports because they've already got this exposure to so many different qualities that they might need.
Yeah, because it's broad enough, and that's very true. And it's the same for ground-based athletes, like successful NFL or hockey or even NBA players could probably a lot of the time make reasonable track athletes, because it's a requirement for them to sprint as well. And that gymnastics example in strength, but also we know about those other transferable skills in rotation and things too. But it doesn't always work. A strong sprint cyclist would be a fool to try and transition across to marathon running.
Only idiots would do something like that.
So on that segue, the last thing we haven't talked about, strength and endurance. So on our picture that we put up at the start, we said that strength could impact endurance. Now, a lot of our listeners might be thinking, well, how? Because it's obvious that the ability to generate maximum force is related to how fast I can move an object, so power, or how quickly I can get to that maximum strength. But how can strength be related to endurance? So I'm thinking endurance like the context I just said, marathon runner, and or endurance cyclist and things.
It
So
links
how
back
is
to your initial point, doesn't it? Where your mates are saying, go running 30 Ks to improve your strength. So hopefully you're about to tell us why they're wrong and how they can improve their strength that's relevant to muscular endurance.
well, do you want me to try and answer this?
Yes.
Okay,
Go
so I think that it mostly, so strength will increase endurance qualities largely by increasing neuromuscular qualities, but potentially tissue qualities as well. And so you need to think about the idea of strength holistically. And so we think about strength as developing muscles, but of course muscles don't just sit there. They attach to tendons, which attach to bones. And so tendons in large part are responsible for that endurance increase in a sport like running, because they increase in elasticity
They're elastic bands.
well, but because of that, we often see similar changes in running performance from relatively simplistic strength interventions. So it might be, well, I saw one the other day, 10 minutes of skipping a day, improves 3K time trial performance. Now that's not strengthening in the traditional sense of thinking about a barbell back squat, but it's strength and conditioning, and it might improve, and it's contextual. The shift though is that your sport, because it's less forceful contractions more repeatedly, then your strength training has to also reflect that to an extent. And so you won't see many endurance athletes doing maximum lifting. Not sometimes you will, there is a place for it, but the reason they often don't is because, one, it creates a lot of soreness, and the injury risk is higher, but two, because it's not always reflective of the requirements of their sport. But there is that argument that if you're increasing the amount of maximum strength, then each contraction you do that is a sub maximum of that is relatively easier as well. And that's kind of true. If I think about that in the gym setting, if I could squat 100 kilo maximum, and then someone asked me to squat 80 kilos for as many reps as I could, then it's pretty difficult. I might get to 5. If my maximum back squat was 200 kilos and I was squatting 80 kilos, then I could probably get to 40. And so as a percentage of that maximum, it becomes easier. So there is reason to potentially train maximum strength, but not always. The other real reason though, which I'm shocking at doing, is from an injury prevention perspective.
100%.
Can you talk to us about that, Sando?
Well, I guess if you're increasing that, the muscle, the tissue's ability to withstand a higher level of stimulus, then it's going to be, I guess, more protected. It's going to have a higher capacity. It's going to be more resilient to undergo that stimulus, whether it be at a lower intensity but more repeated, or higher stimulus less repeated. If you're increasing your maximal strength, injury prevention for runners or endurance athletes, you're going to reduce the risk because you have a higher resilience or capacity.
And I think also, not just from an
done.
injury prevention perspective, if you increase strength and you're already quite well trained from an endurance perspective, you're probably going to be less fatigued at the end of an event. If, for instance, you say run the same time, but now you're stronger and you're using less of your potential force generating capacity, from a theoretical perspective, you're doing less work than you could potentially do before you start fatiguing.
Yeah, because the way I think about it is the muscle, when we think about activity is broken into two sections, one or two components, one being intensity, one being duration. And so, now we're sort of thinking about rate of force development or power and endurance, one on either axis. And if we have an arbitrary capacity which crosses from one axis to the other, an arbitrary sort of line, if we can increase that line in both directions, then the capacity of your muscles increases, which means you can perform an activity at a higher intensity or higher amount of power, and you can also sustain it for longer.
Makes sense. Those structural mechanical qualities don't go in one direction, do they? They can go in more than one direction, in the ability to endure and the ability to produce force. That certainly, I think that makes good sense.
And that's that conditioning aspect of strength.
Well, that's right. And I think we'll start to wrap up now, but I certainly think we could have another 2 episodes on this, and I'm sure this is something you'll come back to.
We've gone off on tangents today too, haven't we?
We have gone off on tangents about definitions, but that is science, and that's a lot of it. There are often elements in science that are discussing the same thing, and they can't agree. Very recently, looking at the female athlete triad, and one group is insistent on calling it that, and the other group's insistent on calling it
another one that springs to mind is
deficiency.
Another one that springs to mind is the triple extension debate. It's just a sort of
and they're kind of saying, they're semantics arguing the same point. And so to come back to strength here, strength is related to a lot of qualities. It's important to touch on, and there are many things that we can explore in the future here. But Baz, can you give us what you think your takeaways around strength training are?
So, I mean, and especially based on our discussions tonight, it is undeniable the importance of strength and strength training in sport performance. If you're currently participating in sport at any level, or if you're looking to improve your sporting performance, then there is no doubt that strength training or conditioning in any aspect is going to help you improve your performance. So just a key takeaway is strength is important for sport performance, in terms of improving any type of movement capacity, even and as well as improving your injury prevention. There are many different types of movement qualities that relate to many different types of sports, and that will typically guide what type of strength training you should do. And as we've discussed tonight, there are many different types of strength training in terms of, how many, how fast, how frequent, the types of exercises. So I think it's really important that you understand your sport. You understand the specifics of the movements that are key in your sport, whether that's a horizontal or vertical force component, whether it's a fast, whether it's an endurance, whether it's a total force component. And trying to understand your sport from those key qualities will help guide these types of strength training that you do.
Just before you go on, Baz, or give another one of our videos a plug. We have done a number of videos on needs analysis. And that's one of the key parts of sports science, which Jared was hinting at there. There is a systematic approach to understand the demands of your sport. So if you look up our YouTube channel and look up needs analysis, you'll see about how do you determine what it is you need to do in terms of developing strength or any other quality. Sorry to interrupt there, mate. Keep going.
That was perfect. Great plug. If you're a novice and you are involved in sport, and when I say novice, you've never explored strength training or strength and conditioning, then it's really important that you just start with something. And as Warnie alluded to, yes, I know it's a bit broad and it's a bit non-specific, but something is better than nothing. Just like make sure that you move properly and be safe, and really advocate for you getting somebody on board like a sports scientist or a strength and conditioning coach who can help you, one, move correctly, but two, can help you decide the types of exercises that you need to do that are going to help with your performance. And just to wrap it all up, is that specificity is key. If you're training to be a basketball athlete to jump higher, there is strength training that you can do to jump higher. If you're a front rower in rugby league, there is strength training that you can do that is specific to your particular position or the types of performances that you need to complete in your sport to be successful.
And I think
Fantastic summary. Letty, sorry, what were you going to say?
just quickly, sometimes the most simple things are the best tools to use. So don't get caught up into gimmicks. Don't go and buy the most expensive piece of equipment to make you jump higher, because sometimes you don't even need the equipment to make yourself jump higher. So just be aware of that.
It's
KISS principle.
Yes, KISS principle. We love that.
It's so true. I see all the time in the gym, people buy these expensive accessories and sensors to track their performance, and oftentimes the simplest metric is, will have you lifted more over time, and then the next extension of that should be, well, in fact, it should be the first thing. Have you got better at your sport? And if you haven't got better at your sport, then it probably doesn't matter what data you're collecting from what special sensor, which comes back to what you were saying, Baz. It has to be specific, and oftentimes you need help to work that out. And I know that's been true for my own training. I've had many years of training and many years of education, yet Ryan, you still programmed for me, because me doing it myself was open to my own interpretations and biases and things, and it wasn't perfect. So it is important to lease it out to the experts,
which is nice, and it leads into. I think if you're listening to this and you go, you've got lots of questions or you don't know where to start, contact us. I mean, we're here to help. We can answer any question and provide guidance on anything in terms of strength training or any types of conditioning. So if you are stuck or you're thinking, what the hell, drop us a line. Happy to help.
Also, just as a disclaimer on that point you made there, Warnie, if you haven't gotten better at your sport, it may not be your strength training either. It might be your technical side of your sport, and that's obviously, comes back to your coach. And that's obviously an important aspect of performance. So strength doesn't improve your technical performance, but it definitely underpins all the other physical attributes.
Yeah, I think we've done an okay job in trying to distill what is an incredibly complex area.
Quickly, Warnie,
and I'm sure we'll come back to it. Yeah, mate.
Don't just think of performance as getting better at your sport, because if you're playing a sport more often and not being injured, that's still better than not playing a sport.
Yeah.
So performance is not just about getting better at your sport. It's also being able to play your sport if you're chronically injured.
Yeah. So to summarize very briefly, strength training is important. Don't have a go at it yourself. Try and seek some information from others that are more experienced in it. Inform your practice so that you can hopefully give yourself the best chance at improving. Guys, is there anything else you'd like to add before we go, or are you happy to sign off for this episode?
Love to see Baz bench 100 kilos.
Yeah, we got close, didn't he? 99.25 or something.
I was happy with 180 deadlift, boys.
Yeah, that was pretty good. All right, on that bombshell, I reckon it's time to end this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in for this episode. Please check us out on YouTube as well if you want to look at the enhanced graphics, and our website, www.sportscicollective.com. And if you have any listener questions, you can drop them on Facebook through Messenger, Instagram through direct message, our website, or our email, which will also be on our website, or even on the YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, and we look forward to interacting with our audience. Guys, it's been a pleasure chatting all things strength and the FIFA 11. Let's not forget that. Until next time, thank you.
See ya.
Thanks, boys.
Yep.